Thank you all for coming. This is the International Affairs Speakers Series. My name is John Presnell. I'm a professor of government here at the college, and we want to welcome you all for attending this event this semester. Today we have Dr. Daniel Byman speaking on, the title we gave it was The Islamic State and American Foreign Policy, but he'll let us know more of the details. I just want to make a few kind of remarks, thanking a few people here. First, just the college and the Board of Trustees for reserving funds for bringing speakers of this sort to the college. We're greatly appreciative. I want to thank Dr. Pam Millsap, Vice President of Instruction, Dr. Steve Sewell, the Dean of Academic Programs, and Stacy Henderson, who is the Department Chair of the Social and Behavioral Sciences. So all of them were very helpful in helping to arrange this event, which was brought together by a committee, the International Speakers Series Committee, and I just want to mention those committee member names. Professor Rafael Naranjo of Spanish, teaches Spanish. Professor Ching Lee teaches economics. Assistant Professor Cody Smith teaches history, and Assistant Professor Samuel Layton teaches government, and we want to thank all of them as well for working to get this organized. And then lastly, I want to just thank Kari Drake, who is the travel and event specialist here. Is she here? But thank her for all of this kind of organizing here. Our speaker today is Dr. Byman, and I don't want to take up a lot of your time, but let me just give a brief introduction here. Dr. Daniel Byman is professor in the Security Studies program in the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service with a concurrent appointment in the Department of Government at Georgetown University. He's the author of several books, including, most recently, Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and the Global Jihadist Movement, What Everyone Needs to Know, from Oxford University Press in 2015. I've been reading it. It's an excellent book, so I highly recommend you all to turn to it as well. He's written other books, as well as on a range of topics, including terrorism, international security, civil and ethnic conflict in the Middle East, and his articles have appeared in Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy. So enough with me. If you please welcome Dr. Daniel Byman today.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for coming out to hear me today, especially with the clouds gathering as I speak. I'd like to thank everyone here for inviting me down, and particular thanks to John for really being truly an excellent host and making this all so easy. I've been tasked today to talk about the Islamic State. What I'd like to do is begin by actually talking about Al-Qaeda, and from there moving on to the Islamic State, because I think the contrast is probably the best way of learning about important distinctions within this broader movement. If you think about Al-Qaeda, this is an organization that emerges from the anti-Soviet struggle in the 1980s in Afghanistan. And it really starts to emerge in 1988. And that's really when the conflict is ending. And the Arabs who had gone to fight in Afghanistan, militarily they were irrelevant. They had almost no significant role. But that didn't matter because they thought they were the ones who defeated the Soviets, right? In their eyes, it was God's hand working through them that enabled them to go to Afghanistan and fight. And several years later, the Soviet Union fell, and they saw a direct line. And they felt that there was a need for an organization to defend Muslims wherever they were under attack. And so what they created was a relatively small group, a group that really mostly numbered a couple hundred people. And in their eyes, it was a vanguard. It was a small group of leaders. And these people would provide assistance wherever Muslims were in danger. And that could be the Balkans, if you remember the wars in the 1990s. It could be Chechnya when the Russians attack. On and on and on. There are lots of places where they felt Muslims were being attacked. Important is that this was also a group of elites. If you think of the leaders, you had, of course, Osama bin Laden, who was the son of one of the wealthiest men in the world. The number two, Ayman Zawahiri, was trained as a surgeon in Egypt, comes from a very illustrious family. So it's an organization of leaders led by elite people in the Middle East. Over time, their focus becomes fighting superpowers. And their argument was that you can't have change in the Middle East unless you remove the puppet master, right? That the governments in the Middle East, whether it's Egypt or Saudi Arabia or Iraq, these are corrupt governments, these are brutal governments, but fighting them directly is kind of useless because the United States will always be there to back them up. So if you want to change the Middle East, you have to fight the United States. Now, as I'm going to argue, the Islamic State is fundamentally different. So where does it come from? This is a movement that's effectively been around for about 12 or 13 years, depending on how you want to date it. And it emerges out of the US invasion of Iraq and the strife that comes from that. And who is the key figure there? It's a guy named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. And he has a really brutal nickname, which tells you a lot about the group. His nickname is the Sheikh of the Slaughterers. And he goes to Iraq in preparation for the US invasion and rallies people there to fight in the name of Islam. So it's a society that in the past had not had a strong jihadist element. And he pushes an anti-US struggle, but he's not an elite. He's someone who grew up in Jordan. He was a drug dealer, probably a pimp. He spent time in jail. He did go to Afghanistan to fight, but he arrived too late to fight the Soviets. So he fought in some of the mini civil wars between different militias in Afghanistan. But he really makes his name when he goes to Iraq. And he makes his name through savagery. Some of the things many people are commenting on now, we saw over a decade ago. So how does he make his name? He personally beheads several hostages, including a US contractor, Nicholas Berg. And he videotapes it. And I know that many of you in this audience, the internet has always been part of your life. But there was a time when one did not watch videos on the internet. And as that ability is happening in the early 2000s, when people start to regularly just watch small videos on the internet, he is disseminating videos of executions. Right? So he's someone who's taking advantage of new technologies to make a name for himself, and it works. Lots of foreigners start to come to Iraq to fight, and who do they want to fight with? They want to fight with this guy, Zarqawi. And this movement seems ascendant. So in 2005, 2006, a couple years after the US is there, things look like a disaster in Iraq. There's calls for a very precipitous US withdrawal. And you have a massive civil war. And the civil war is in part between the government of Iraq, which is a Shia Muslim government. It's a government that has close ties to Iran, another Shia country, and the Sunnis in the western part of the country. And they're fighting each other brutally, and the United States is almost a bystander as this starts to heat up. So it goes from an anti-US struggle to a religious civil war within the organization. And in addition to pushing civil war, what they also push is intimidation. They want to rule parts of Iraq. And how are they ruling? They're taking over and they're killing lots of people in areas they rule in order to force people to obey. So they're killing tribal leaders. They're killing moderate religious figures. They're killing Muslims who disagree with them. And their view is that the way to an Islamic State is to impose it. And they declare an Islamic State in 2006. Right? So you have a group that begins its name Oneness and Unity in Jihad, which no one has ever heard of. But it takes on the name Al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2004. But in 2006, it changes its name again to the Islamic State of Iraq. Right? And over time, it becomes the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. But you could see the progression where it's taking on this label. Now, there's a brief moment where things in Iraq look hopeful. So starting really in 2006, 2007, there was a change in US strategy. This is made famous by General Petraeus, where the United States starts to do a much better job working with the Iraqi tribes and the Iraqi people against the radicals. And the radicals, the Zarqawi types, they mistreat people. They abuse them. They try to grab power from leaders. And they alienate people. And the people were able to fight back because they had US backing. So it's not just that they wanted to resist, it's that they had someone strong to help them resist. And from a counterterrorism point of view, the biggest US problem had always been finding the bad guys. Right? You'd go into a village of Iraqis and you wouldn't know who was who. But now you have local tribes that are there with you and they say, that person doesn't belong. And it's over. Right? Within a 6-month period, the Al-Qaeda types are losing 60, 70% of their senior leadership. Right? It's this dramatic, very fast turnaround because the local people are suddenly on the side of the United States. Now, there are two possible lessons from this experience. Bin Laden's successor, the head of al-Qaeda, Ayman Zawahiri, his lesson was basically the same lesson that the United States learned. So you should treat the locals well, try to gain their goodwill. Don't declare a state. Right? He said if you declare an Islamic State, it's stupid because all you're doing is telling the United States where to bomb. Right? That this is just a really silly way of focusing U.S. energy. Also, when in doubt, put a local face on things. So in Iraq, you put an Iraqi face on things. Later on in Syria, you put a Syrian face on things because people don't like foreigners. Right? So even if we're fighting in the name of Islam, these differences nationally will still matter. In general, you want to work with others and support them. If there are other groups fighting the United States, help them out. The Islamic State's lesson was exactly the opposite. Their lesson was we didn't use enough violence. Right? That people weren't afraid of us enough. Also that because they are a legitimate state and all these other groups fighting the Americans or fighting the Shia Muslims are just warlords, they should be in charge. So everyone should kind of bow down before them and accept their leadership. They also believe that a key factor in fighting our foreign fighters are people who come from other countries, who are often the most zealous, the most willing to kill themselves, and in general, the most willing to be committed to the cause. So two very different lessons. But at the time, these are lessons within one group. You have this group that's the Islamic State of Iraq. I'll spare you all the name changes, but it's still there. And they're having an argument within themselves on what they should have learned. Then things start to go very bad. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One is that after the US withdraws, we start to lose leverage. So the government in Baghdad, the Shia government in Baghdad, starts to systematically exclude Sunni Muslims. So there's a host of measures that are discriminatory. There are these various militia bands that were Sunni bands that were working with the United States. They stop paying them. They actually start to arrest some of their leaders. And they see these groups as a threat. So the Sunni population in Iraq becomes alienated from the government again. So the argument of the Islamic State types that we're here to defend you against a government, a Shia government that's evil, that starts to get a lot of credibility. The second development is that there's a civil war that breaks out in Syria next door. And Syria was a particularly propitious place for a civil war. One reason is that the Syrian government had been supporting the flow of foreign fighters from the Muslim world into Iraq for 8 years. So you have all these networks inside Syria. You have safe houses, you have recruiters, you have people who do training. And so it's very easy to go not just from Syria to Iraq, but back from Iraq to Syria. So it's easy for this group to make the transition. You also have a collapsing government. So small groups can operate relatively unhindered because there's no one to stop them. Right? So it might be 50 people, 75 people who in the past would have been arrested or killed. Now there's no one to arrest or kill them. But a big thing is the Syrian government. This is going to sound strange, but the Syrian government deliberately facilitated the rise of the Islamic State. Early on, when the violence was very limited, it let a bunch of jihadists, terrorists out of jail. It also encouraged some of its loyalists, who are part of a minority group that's kind of like the Shia that we call Alawis. It encouraged its loyalists to go in and do atrocities against ordinary Sunni Muslims. The result was Sunni Muslim groups began to do atrocities against minorities. And the regime was able to cobble together a coalition of minorities against the opposition. It was saying to others, you see what the opposition's like? They're crazy fanatics. We're here to defend you. And it was saying to the international community, they're crazy terrorists. We're here to defend civilization. Right? So, and I have to confess, this has worked. Right? So the opposition, which in 2011 was not at all jihadist or terrorist, by 2016 has a huge jihadist presence. And they've been able to change the whole debate. And many people in the United States are saying that Assad is the lesser of two evils. Right? That he's a horrible person, but the jihadists are worse. And that was a deliberate strategy on his part, was to force people to make that choice. So the Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the Islamic State in Iraq, moves back to Syria. And initially, it creates a front group. And that front group is called Jabhat al-Nusra. And I'm sorry to confuse you with these 2,000 initials. But it creates this group, and there's a question, which is this group part of the Islamic State of Iraq, or is it part of Al-Qaeda? And there's a huge division on this. And Jabhat al-Nusra, which is very successful, is starting to attract funds and recruits from everywhere around the Muslim world because Syria is at the center of that debate, right? If you're in the Muslim world in 2012, 2013, you're looking at Syria. So who controls this group controls the gold mine from a jihadist point of view. So you have a debate. And the Islamic State of Iraq says, hey, everyone, just so you know, this group, Jabhat al-Nusra, is part of us. They're loyal to us. They're subordinate to us. And Jabhat al-Nusra says, not so fast. We're going to appeal over your head. And we're going to appeal over your head to the head of Al-Qaeda, who you're supposedly loyal to, and say, we're going to be independent. Ayman Zawahiri, the head of Al-Qaeda, agrees with Jabhat al-Nusra, and it causes a split. So that's when the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria emerges from this split, where it refuses to accept the authority of Zawahiri. It splits Jabhat al-Nusra in half and leads to thousands of people dying in the fighting, right? This is jihadist on jihadist fighting in this realm. They have two very different visions, and both groups right now are very strong in Syria. Okay, there may have been too many acronyms, may have been too much history, but that's kind of where we are today. So notionally, what does the Islamic State want? It has a very different set of objectives than Al-Qaeda. One of its biggest goals is sectarianism. So its view is that the biggest enemy are the Shia Muslims, right? Those who are next to us in faith, but have fallen from the true faith, right? That they're much worse than Christians or Jews or others because Christians or Jews or others, in a way you can't blame them because they've never fully embraced the true faith. But someone who has read the Quran, who knows what they feel are the teachings of God, that person who turns away from it, that person is the worst. So they hate apostates. And that's where a lot of their energy is fighting Shia Muslims. And so they see Iran, which is a Shia power, a group in Lebanon called Hezbollah, which is an anti-US group as well, but a Shia group. They see those as their big enemies. A second thing they embrace is a sense of apocalypticism. If you go back to when the Quran was written, it comes at a time, I should back up, I'm sorry. If you go back to a lot of Muslim law and authority comes from the sayings of the Prophet. And these are written down in a period when Syria is very much in play in terms of who's going to rule it and the conquest of Syria. And so you have a lot of people who are reading the sayings of the Prophet today and hearing these names in Syria, and they sound so evocative, right? For those of you who have looked at British history 100 years ago or so, when they're starting to colonize Israel and Palestine, and they're hearing these names like Hebron, right? These names that all of us have read in our Bible, and they're thinking that this is just like it was 2,000, 3,000 years ago, right? And that's what many Muslims today, when they hear these names, they're evoking these kind of ancient disputes. And there's a strong sense of apocalypticism in the Muslim world today, where the majority of people believe the Messiah is going to come relatively soon. And so that's been an attraction as well, where they are arguing that they are fighting the last battles, and the last battles are going to be in Syria. In general, they're focused not on the what they would call the near enemy. So whether it's Shia Muslims or local regimes that oppose them, whether it's Jordan or Saudi Arabia or Lebanon or Turkey, they're focused on that part of the world. And so Al-Qaeda's argument was, if you want to change that part of the world, you have to focus on the United States. The Islamic State doesn't buy that. It believes you can operate locally. Also important, it seeks to govern. Right? I mentioned that Al-Qaeda said that if you build an Islamic State, you're basically putting a bullseye on yourself. The Islamic State disagrees strongly and believes one of their primary goals should be to create a true Islamic State where Muslims can live, in their eyes, under what they feel is true Islamic law. And it's worth pointing out that Al-Qaeda opposes all of these. Right? Al-Qaeda doesn't believe in apocalypticism. Al-Qaeda has opposed sectarianism. Al-Qaeda says, don't focus on the near enemy, focus on the United States. And so there's a long list of differences that have a big impact in terms of where the danger is. But the Islamic State is an exceptionally dynamic movement. And if you think about this rivalry between the two groups, the Islamic State is winning. Right? The Al-Qaeda core organization, so the organization that's primarily in Pakistan today, its big accomplishment in the last 5 years has been kidnapping a 73-year-old American aid worker who was doing work in Pakistan and who dies in a US drone strike by accident. Right? That's what they've done in the last 5 years. Right? And compare that to the Islamic State, which carved out an area the size of Great Britain and imposed Islamic law in it. Right? There's no comparison in terms of the level of accomplishments. And the Islamic State is spreading. It has what it calls provinces in Libya, in Sinai, in Afghanistan, and other parts of the Muslim world. So it's trying to spread its model. Now, how has it been so successful? What are its strengths? I would say a couple things. One, which is going to sound a little silly to you, part of why they're winning is because they have an image of being winners, right? And that they're the people who have done all this stuff. And they've created a state, they've fought enemy armies, they're killing Shia. And as a result, if you are a young Muslim who's inspired by this cause, they're the ones getting stuff done. And you want to join up with them, right? And this is something you see again and again, which is successful organizations attract better people. And because they attract better people, they're more successful. So part of their appeal is that they're winning. But they also have an ideology that's appealing. And I want to stress this ideology has surprisingly little to do with Islam. The vast majority of Muslim leaders, religious leaders, have strongly condemned it, right, to the point where they think it's farcical. But the ideology is much more about, this is a technical term, being badass, right? So that's what they would push, right, which is they're the ones who kill in the most horrific ways, right? They embrace sexual slavery, right? They embrace a propaganda that's more like a video game. Right? You can go online and see the propaganda with lots of stuff blowing up and exhortations, and it's kind of cool. And remember that they're appealing to, I'll insult half the people in this room, but they're appealing to young males. Right? So if I gave you a headline, I have teenage boys. Right? If I gave you a headline that said, teenage boy does something stupid, right? You could put about 10,000 things under that headline. And they're appealing to that mindset. And what you see again and again are individuals who you'll hear stories where they were a good student, they were studious, they were hardworking, they loved their family, and then boom, they switch, and 3 months later they're in Syria. Because it's an age when people are changeable, when people change their social habits, their political beliefs very, very rapidly. They are also now able to use the rewards of government to help their cause. So because they control territory, they can tax. Right? The biggest source of income is actually taxation. They're able to tax the people under their control. They're able to use their haven to have training camps and to bring in supplies. They're able to use their haven to have families come in and live. And so they're pushing the image that it's appealing to live there. Right? And again, go back to their propaganda. And they've actually been able to attract a surprising number of women to go there as well. And that's a historic first in a way, which is the various foreign fighter conflicts, in the past, it was all men. In this one, it's still mainly men. I don't want to oversell this one. But there are significant numbers of women who are going there. So what's their strategy? Their primary goal is to consolidate their state. And this is a very old-fashioned approach. So they want to use their money and their fighters to defend their state and then expand it. And then when they control more territory and more people, they'll tax more, they'll recruit more, and expand further. Right? This is, if you go back to early modern Europe, this is a time-honored way of building power. And while they're there, they're using terror to impose Islamic law. So they'll say, here's the way it should be. If you are a Muslim religious minority, so a Shia, you're in big trouble. If you are a Christian, you're in pretty big trouble. It's better to be a Christian than to be a Muslim religious minority. And most of those communities flee. Right? And so, not surprisingly, the Syrian refugee conflict is the biggest one in the world. right? Where in Syria, over half the population is either a refugee or displaced, right? It's staggering. And they're also trying to use this territory to gather sympathizers from around the world. And so they've been able to attract over 35,000 foreign fighters. And if you combine Afghanistan, Iraq, Mali, Somalia, Chechnya, all these other fights combined, they don't equal Syria. Right? So Syria is off the charts in terms of magnitude. Because their goals are different, they also use terrorism differently. So with Al-Qaeda, again, small group. Okay, I'm going to kind of beat that point to death in front of you all today. And so they're using terror to strike at the United States, strike at other enemies, and compel them to pay attention, and either intimidate them or force them to leave. So if you look at 9/11, there are two possibilities from their point of view. One is that the US, their view was, which was wrong, can't take casualties. So you hit the United States hard, we give in. The other was, even if they don't, the US will overreact, go into the Muslim world, alienate Muslims, and people will rally to our side. So either way, we win was their argument. So terrorism was very much at the core of Al-Qaeda's strategy. For the Islamic State, they're primarily about civil war. So most of what they do is regular civil war fighting. They have tanks, right? They have artillery. They have armored personnel carriers. They're doing lots of conventional operations. And then in many areas, they're doing lots of guerrilla war. Much of what they do that we would call terrorism is part of a civil war. So they'll do suicide bombing attacks, say, on the police or military barracks of their enemy, right? And that's, there are definitions you can use that would call it terrorism. Some would, some wouldn't. But that's very much about defeating a civil war enemy rather than the international terrorism that we saw Al-Qaeda do. And they're even using it, suicide bombers, the way the United States would use maneuver war, right? So they'll have, they'll throw 10 suicide bombers at the gate area of a fortified compound. They'll blow themselves up, they'll kill the guards, and then that will allow the bulk of the Islamic State's more conventional forces to go through. Right? So this is a use of suicide bombers on a scale that no other group has been able to do. And it's a very different use. But the Islamic State, as we all know, also does terrorism in Europe and the United States. I would say that it is less focused on terrorism so far, lots of caveats there, than Al-Qaeda has been. And if you look at the Paris attack in particular, we're still learning why they did that, right? Part of it is a genuine hatred of France. But part of it was also a sense of revenge, that France had been attacking the Islamic State and they were striking back. But also, and this is one to consider, because the Islamic State has been losing territory in Iraq, they still want to be seen as winners. And terrorism is a way of changing the debate. Sure, they've lost 30% of their territory in Iraq in the last year, but they hit Paris, right? And we think of it that way, right? From a US point of view, losing 30% of their territory in Iraq is less than the attack on Paris, right? So they've been able to shift the debate through international terrorism. But primarily in the West, they've relied on what we call lone wolves. So individuals they inspire, but not individuals they control. People who have no direct relationship to the group beyond sharing its ideology. Now, the scary thing is there's tremendous potential here. There have been roughly 6,000 Westerners that have gone to fight with the Islamic State, right? And that's just, again, that's a staggering number. Remember I said that Al-Qaeda at its core, at its peak was kind of, several hundred, let's say 500 notionally. So we're talking a much greater level of potential, but most of these recruits are going to be fighting in Iraq and Syria. Talk briefly about lone wolves. Lone wolves are very, very hard to stop. Right? By definition, they're not tied to the main group. And a lot of times we're able to stop terrorism by spying on the group abroad, seeing who it's talking to on the phone or sending emails to, and with that information, disrupting things at home. So the FBI director testified several years ago that the bulk of his arrests in the United States came from tips abroad. But with lone wolves, you're not going to have that. So those connections, you're not going to be able to monitor. And if you have a case as you had in San Bernardino, where the individuals largely stay off the radar screen, it's incredibly difficult to disrupt them. And because the Islamic State has cool propaganda, you're going to see some of these. Ironically, it's often individuals who wanted to go to fight in Iraq and Syria, but who couldn't get there, right? Who were stopped from traveling or who were otherwise concerned they couldn't make it. And the Islamic State will sometimes do that, where they'll say to an individual, you should attack at home. And they're often doing that because they don't trust the individual to come to Iraq and Syria. They think they might be a spy. So from their point of view, if they do an attack at home, it's a win, right? And they're not taking a risk, but they're still getting a benefit. For the most part, lone wolves tend to be less skilled and less able to sustain operations. Right? That's not reassuring to those who are killed by the attack, but you have to think about both the attack and what could have happened. Right? So if you look at Al-Qaeda lone wolf attack, which is the Boston Marathon bombing, very few people died. Right? It was horrible, but it's in the end really 5 people die. The bombers were remarkably incompetent for the most part. Right? If they had simply purchased firearms and just began shooting at crowds, they would have been far more successful. And that's not, again, meant to be reassuring, especially to those who know people who lost family members. But it's important to note that even as this is scary, things could be much worse. I give a talk on the threat to the U.S. homeland at times, and my working title is always Be Afraid, Be a Little Afraid. And I don't want to minimize the threat, right? And especially after something like San Bernardino. It seems glib to do so. But many of the people who attack in the United States are remarkably unskilled, right? And that's because they haven't had the ability to go overseas and be trained, right? So it's not that they're stupid, it's just that they don't know what they're doing, right? So the equivalent, some of you are, I suspect most of you are better than I, but I've occasionally wrestled with that impossible task of putting together IKEA furniture, right? And imagine that was a bomb, and every time I messed something up, it went boom, right? I'd be dead about 20 times, right? And so a lot of, even something like building a bomb, which many people think is relatively easy to learn, you really want to learn it right. And you really want people to teach you how to do it properly. And we have a lot of cases of people being exceptionally stupid that we monitored in the 15 years since 9/11. And I think part of our problem in some ways is the FBI, to its credit, has been disrupting these people. But it sounds better if you say what they were planning to do rather than what they actually could do. So this will require a long memory from many of you and a sense of detail. But over a decade ago, there was a planned attack that was disrupted where it was going to topple the Willis Tower, the Sears Tower in Chicago. And who were these people? They were a bunch of guys who'd gotten out of prison who were smoking dope in Florida. And they thought it'd be really cool. They purchased a bomb, they think, from an FBI guy. So it's an FBI informant who kind of runs it. And their plan is to blow up the Sears Tower, have it fall over. It will fall into Lake Michigan and produce a tsunami that will wipe out the rest along the shore, right? And my family's from Chicago. The Sears Tower is actually not on the lake, first of all, right? So that's just, geographically, that's wrong. And then we all know after 9/11 that towers don't tip over unless they're made of Legos, right? They crumble. And obviously, it's not going to produce a tsunami. So there's been a lot of kind of very alarmist reporting when a lot of the cases are individuals who I think we should probably be laughing at. And very important is most of the plots in the United States most of the plotters have been turned over with information and help from a sympathetic U.S. Muslim community, right? So the U.S. Muslim community has been on the side of government, working with the FBI, working with local police. And it's been a huge advantage. And one difference I would say between the United States and Europe is in Europe, the Muslim community is much more alienated from the government. So they're much less likely to work with security officials there. So the risk of terrorism is much greater in Europe just because there might be hostile activities happening in an apartment next door and people won't call the police, while in the United States they would. The bigger danger, I would say, to think about is the implications for the Arab world. Right? We've already seen disaster sweep Syria with roughly almost 400,000 people killed, according to the latest estimates. But if you look at this model, it's spreading. So we're seeing it crop up, as I mentioned, in Egypt and Libya and Afghanistan. And it's making the civil wars there worse. And to the extent that the United States has interests in the Middle East, these are jeopardized by the spread of civil war and the spread of instability. So there's a humanitarian concern, but the United States has long seen the Middle East as an area of strategic interest. And when I began my career in government 20 years ago, the problem with the Middle East, it's going to sound strange, was that it was too stable. Right? You had all these leaders who had been there for decades, right? So I could rattle off these names. So, the current leader of Syria, his father, Assad, the current leader of Jordan, in Egypt, you had this guy Mubarak who was there for decades. You had Gaddafi who was there for decades. You had all these people who had been there forever. And now the problem in the Middle East is chaos and civil war. And it's a host of really bad options, but we're seeing the Islamic State model, if you will, start to spread beyond the immediate Iraq and Syria theater. So what are some implications to think about? A few things. An obvious one is the need for intelligence sharing. This is the sort of problem where some of the pieces might come from Saudi Arabia, some might come from Syria, some might come from France, some might come from Canada, and some might come from the United States. Right? That's a plot that is quite plausible. And you need to have all those countries working together. And one role the United States plays is kind of you could say concert master or circus master, depending on your image of how this works, but is working together with all these places where one of them might arrest a suspected terrorist and look at his phone, and that number might be traced to another country, and the United States will work with that other country, and they'll discover that that individual is in contact with 5 other people, and you could see the pieces being put together. So intelligence coordination around the world is a vital part of this. I would say we've had a couple failures I'd point out. One is that in recent years, in the last 3 or 4 years, I would say the bigotry and the hostility towards the American Muslim population has skyrocketed. And it's self-defeating, right? If your goal is to fight terrorism, then this is a community that's been very supportive of law enforcement. But if people alienate it, then it's both going to cause small elements, but nevertheless elements to become more radical. And more importantly, it's going to lead the community not to police itself, to distrust law enforcement. And that's incredibly dangerous. Right? So many of the people who are most upset by the bigotry coming out of the mouths of some American leaders are local cops, right? Because they work with these people, right? And they know it's going to make their job a lot harder. A second thing we haven't done is we haven't institutionalized a lot of programs. If you go back to the immediate post-9/11 era, so we have things like Guantanamo, domestic wiretapping, an accelerated program of what we call renditions, so basically kidnapping suspected terrorists and sending them elsewhere, killing terrorists through drones. I suspect in this room we all have different opinions on these things, but the problem is we haven't had Congress pass legislation on this. So the result is all the power resides in the executive branch. And that's going to change, right? I have no idea who's going to win the US election in 2016, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say in the next 25 years we'll have one president who's a liberal and one who's a conservative. And if you believe that, that means you need policies that can stretch across governments, because it takes sometimes 10 years to set up these programs and get them running. So you can't just turn them on and off. And you do that through legislation. You do that by having Congress debate and, God forbid, compromise and make decisions, right? And the result has been, it's largely been the courts and the presidency. The last thing I'll say on the failure element, before I get to some better news, is that there's been a resilience failure, right? As you could tell, my view on the threat to the American homeland is that there is a danger, but it's not overwhelming. If you include 9/11, from the period between 1970 and 2013, your chance of being killed by a terrorist in the US homeland was 1 in 4 million. If you exclude 9/11, and there are reasons to think 9/11 was an outlier, it's 1 in 90 million. Now, it's unfair to say this is less than being struck by lightning, because it's dramatically less than being struck by lightning, right? There's really no comparison. Yet we've allowed ourselves where even a small terrorist attack is an overwhelming event, right? And now I believe very strongly that the FBI, the CIA, people in general should be fighting very hard against terrorism. But if you go back to September 12, 2001, people like me were wrong, right? We said there would be another significant terrorist attack on the United States soon. And it hasn't happened. And that's great news, right? And I don't think saying, oh, there was a horrible attack in Boston or a horrible attack in San Bernardino means that's fundamentally wrong, right? I don't think we can lower the bar to the point where 4 individuals dying, 19 individuals dying is enough to say there's a crisis. Again, we still should be going after these people. But we also need to accept that terrorism is going to be a part of modern life. And if we allow it to dominate everything in our society, we're really doing the terrorists a favor. We're making it much easier for them to scare us. I'll say a brief note on social media, which I always think is important when I'm talking to a younger audience. There is kind of a hysteria in some circles about the Islamic State's ability to use social media. And they have a lot of videos, and they have a lot of Twitter accounts. And one change is that now if you're fighting in Iraq or Syria, you can stay in touch with your friends back home, right? It's not that you go and then you come show up 5 years later and tell them your stories, right? You're doing it live. And I don't know any of your Facebook pages, but I'm guessing most of your Facebook pages show you and your friends having fun and having a good time. You don't put the, here's a picture of me studying for 3 hours, or here's me, washing dishes or anything like that. When people are in war zones, they do the same thing, right? They're trying to tell people how cool they are and how meaningful what they're doing is. So they're sending back lots of images. And these images work, right? They're attracting other people. And one of the joys of social media, as you all know, is that it's person to person, right? So it's not Dan Byman, who doesn't know any of you, thinking of what might appeal to this audience and creating images, right? It's individuals in this room talking to their friends, and you know what appeals to your friends, right? So it's very, very powerful for recruitment. But the good news, and I did promise good news on this one, is that this is a counterintelligence nightmare. Back when I was in government, we used to spend a huge amount of time trying to figure out if this person knew this other person, right? Is there any connection, right? And you'd spend even more time saying, who don't we know, right? And now we have that answer, right? If I know your friends and your followers, I kind of know everything about you, right? And so the big question we used to have in the past was, how do we find the person who hasn't done anything yet? And now we're much more likely to find that person because they're connected through the social media. And the result is this is kind of a counterintelligence dream. For those of you who rely on America's finest news source, The Onion, they had a wonderful story about CIA agent Mark Zuckerberg and his Facebook plan, because everyone was giving all this personal information about themselves, right? They were describing their friends and their political beliefs and where they'd be. And so there's tremendous information available for government to scoop up. And I'll conclude by talking briefly about fighting the Islamic State. The challenge is, I would say, much, much easier than Al-Qaeda and much, much harder. So let's start with the easy stuff. Al-Qaeda is small, dispersed, it's around the Muslim world, it's buried into these local communities and very hard to discover where these people are. They work with other groups, so often when you fight Al-Qaeda, you're fighting another group that's protecting them. The Islamic State, though, we know where it's based, we know where its leaders are, in a rough sense, that is, and it controls territory. And the United States and its allies are really good at fighting wars over territory, right? If it's a conventional conflict between US and NATO forces and Islamic State forces, this thing's over in minutes, right? We are far more firepower, far better trained, everything is on our side. However, understandably, I think President Obama is reluctant to have that fight because the question he's asking is a very difficult one, which is, and then what do we do, right? So we won, right? The Islamic State is forced underground. We pushed them out of power in Raqqa and Mosul and hooray. And now we do what, right? And the answer we all want is we hand it over to local forces who will govern and who are competent. But they don't exist. So what do we do with them? And we've been trying to create local forces. We've been trying to work with local governments. People say we should work with Assad because he's brutal, but at least he imposes order. We don't have a good answer to that question. So what we end up doing is a much more limited approach, relying very heavily on air power, that limits our exposure and keeps the Islamic State contained, at times pushes it back. So it's a compromise, right? And it's a compromise that we can all criticize because there are still going to be attacks, right? This group is still going to be strong. It's still recruiting people. It will still do attacks in Europe and perhaps even in the United States. So all this will continue. But the question is, do we want to go the next step? And would that be incredibly dangerous? So it's a question that, to me, that I'll end with, which is, to me, it's a political question, not one of expertise, right? It's not that I, because I study terrorism, know more than anyone in this room. It's a question that we as citizens have to wrestle with, which is, how much danger are we willing to take in the homeland and to our allies versus how much of a commitment are we willing to make to a Syria that is a mess and where there's no real answer in terms of governance, at least in the short and immediate term. And both those are miserable choices, but we're going to have to choose on one side or the other. So with that, let me stop, and I'll welcome any questions or vehement disagreements. Sir.
Chris Reed, I'm in the nursing program. One question I have deals with, I felt that one of the problems we had in the Middle East was the fact that a lot of the people are more aligned towards religion and tribes than they are nationality. And if we were to somehow draw national lines towards that, the tribals, the tribes, and not towards nations. Because basically what we did, I shouldn't say we, but basically what happened was we took all these people, we put lines around them and said you're a country, but they still have conflict. But if we draw the lines around agreed tribal lines, would that help?
And this is a broader problem in the Middle East, which is that you do have national identities, so being Syrian or being Jordanian or whatever, but you have lots of other identities, right? And a comparison I would make is, you know, I teach at Georgetown University, and Georgetown's colors are blue and gray, right? And why? Because this was the North and South in the American Civil War, and Georgetown, you know, being a Washington, D.C. school, is right on the border, and it tore the school apart, right? So the hope was by having both colors, it would promote unity after the Civil War. And 150 years ago, I don't have to say it's in Texas, right? 150 years ago, the idea of a state identity being strong was obvious, right? And there was a real question of would people fight for a federal identity, for a national identity? And in the Middle East, you'd magnify that because you'd have not just state, but you'd have religion, you'd have tribe, you have all these different groups. And so there are all these identities. Part of the problem is because you have all these identities, there's no good answer to that question of where you draw the lines. So in some cases, it might be tribe. In other cases, it might be ethnicity. In other cases, it might be religion. In some cases, it might be national. And no one can agree where the lines are. I actually used to be a believer in doing this in some places, especially in Iraq, kind of early in my career. And then I tried to think it through in terms of, well, who gets what? Like a very specific, you know, who gets this city and who gets this city. And I couldn't do it in a way where the locals wouldn't fight about it, right? And so if I said to you all, you know, we're going to divide the United States along community lines, there'd be a lot of disagreement on where those lines are. And it's the same problem in the Middle East. Yes?
Is there a way to create a local culture that provides stability, that you can have a stable government that we can rely on in these areas of conflict?
This is a really difficult challenge because I'll say two things. One is in order to have that kind of local culture providing stability, you need some degree of peace in the first place, right? So when war is raging, you're just not going to have that. People are going to be afraid for their families, afraid for their lives. So you need to kind of calm the violence down. But the next thing is really hard, and what you need are ways to get people to think of one another as part of the same community. And that's very easy to say. And I have no realistic idea how to do that, right? I have a few tricks you do, right? So one is notionally you might have political parties where to run for office, you have to have people from multiple communities, right? So you can't have this is the party of this group and this is the party of this other group. Another is to kind of have a lot of the decisions be local. So no one fights about who's in charge as much because the federal government doesn't matter that much. But all these things help at the margins. And one thing the United States is pretty bad at is trying to foster new cultures and new ideas. And I don't want to be critical of the United States. This is just a hard thing in general. And so I'm sympathetic to this idea, but I have trouble kind of figuring out a way to do it. So I've become more conservative as I've gotten older, just on the belief that a lot of these ideas are good ideas, but very hard to implement. Sir.
What about the moral issue of dealing with regimes that are violating human rights? I think a lot of the problem with the U.S. Reputation in a lot of these countries is that we haven't always stood for that in the past. And do you see any way in the future that that can happen?
There's one thing, if you travel to the Middle East, one thing you'll find is the better relations the United States has with the government, in the Arab world, I should say, or Muslim world, the worse we have with the people. Right? So we have great relations with the Jordanian government. And the Jordanian people really don't like the United States. The Iranian government, historically, we've had horrible relations with. And where did pro-US spontaneous demonstrations break out after 9/11? Candlelight vigils, Iran. Right? Because if the United States is seen as on the side of tyranny, understandably, the people don't like it. If we're seen as opposing it, the people like it. The problem is we have interests. Right? And those interests tend to involve working with governments. And so we haven't found a way to kind of square that circle. And part of it is, whenever we've tried to promote democracy, it hasn't worked well. So most presidents say, if you could guarantee me a democracy here, that if I jeopardize our interests, I'll do it. But since you can't guarantee it, and since it might make things worse, I'll work with the dictator. And almost every president comes in not liking that answer, and almost every president works with the dictator. Sir.
In your opinion, which side of this refugee media, I mean, one is like feel bad for the poor people,
right.
The other half is they're all males and the wives and kids are left behind, and they're the terrorists, right. There's probably some truth in both, and there's got to be a balance for us, is how we respond.
I tend to be on the poor people side, so just kind of lay my cards on the table. I would say a few things. There will be, it's a very inefficient way to send terrorists to the United States, is via the refugee route, because it's a 2-year vetting process. There's a lot of background checks. There are relatively few taken. It's just kind of a stupid way to send terrorists to the United States. It'd be much smarter to just send someone to Europe and have them buy an airplane and a tourist visa and go to Orlando. There's the refugees versus the visitors in general, right? And the Orlando, the person would just be coming for a week notionally. Historically, refugees have not been a big terrorism problem. The bigger danger, again, gets to this alienation issue, right? So the contrast I would draw is the vast majority of the American Muslim population is well-educated, better educated than the average non-Muslim, and wealthier than the average non-Muslim, right? Very successful immigrant group. The exception to that has been the Somali American community. And there you have tremendous poverty and tremendous alienation and a much bigger terrorism problem. And so to me, I'm a believer in taking refugees, but what you want to do is take in refugees and then spend a lot of time making sure they are assimilated. The thing I would stress is we're really good at this. Right? So I was talking to a colleague of mine who's an expert on refugee flows, was in Scandinavia, and I think it was Sweden, she was saying, where she was talking to a refugee there, who in Sweden you get 3 years of salary to learn Swedish as a refugee, right? And full benefits, like it's a dream, right, from a kind of socialist economy state, right? It's amazing. And she was talking to a refugee there who was begging for information on how to get to the United States. Right? And she was like, are you crazy? Right? Like, look at what you're getting here. You're not going to get that in the United States, right? Not even close. He said, why would you want to do that? And he said, because in Sweden, I don't think my kids will ever be Swedish. But if I come to America, my kids will be American. And we're really, really good at this, right? So we've taken Vietnamese, right? We've taken Cubans, we've taken all these different groups, and who's running for president now, right? Who are two of the leading candidates, right? Cuban Americans. And this is a success story, and there will be some problems, right? I don't want to sit there and say every single person's going to be wonderful and self-made millionaire who's going to make our economy great, right? But the FBI is actually very good, and they are able to find drug dealers and rapists and so on in lots of different communities, and they'll monitor this community. So between the background checks and the monitoring, I would actually like to see us take more of those, but recognizing, to your point, it's not a black and white issue, right? It's not that you open the floodgates, let everyone in, and it'll all be fine. Yes?
Talking about the newest thing about the Islamic State. But isn't it the Saudi Arabian government also Islamic State. And then the Wahhabis just as bad as the Islamic State now is here. Didn't they destroy all the Shiite temples? Didn't they kill everybody who was from Wahhabi? And we, Americans, are working with them.
So for those of you who couldn't hear, the question was on Saudi Arabia, and aren't they really just another version of the Islamic State? Yes and no. You know, the Saudi regime beheads people on a regular basis, right? So that's punishment. The Saudi regime spreads a rather extreme and intolerant version of Islam. The Saudi government also historically destroyed shrines, was very anti-Shia. But the Saudi government does not remotely approach the level of brutality of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, right? The Saudi government doesn't do sexual slavery. Very important from a US point of view, the Saudi government doesn't go to war, right? It's not attacking its neighbors. There are, roughly 20%, I think, of the population of the kingdom is Shia Muslim, and they face real discrimination, but they're not being killed. They're not being lined up and shot, right? So I would say that the Saudi government certainly has many faults, but I wouldn't put it at the same level as the Islamic State or close to it. Yes, in the back.
Is there a way to cut the money flow to ISIS? Is there a way to cut their money flow?
Most of the Islamic State's money flow is coming from taxation or oil sales. And we've been disrupting some of the oil sales because you can see it, right? You can see trucks or tankers going across the border, and we've been pretty effective. And again, as you all know better than I, the collapse in the price of oil has done a lot of the job for us, right? Where they just can't get as much money for it. Taxation, we can't really stop. So we remove them from territory, but that's harder to stop. There has been some success in cutting foreign donations, but the US Treasury assessment is that was only about 3% of their income in the first place. So they didn't feel that was that significant. So, yes? Would you have a question? I'm sorry.
Yes. Do you think there's really anything of importance on the San Bernardino cell phone, the shooter's cell phone?
Obviously, to state the obvious, I have no idea, right? Because if I knew that, I would presumably be talking to the FBI now, one way or another. This is a fundamental question, right? Where I love to put it before my students of privacy versus security. I come from a national security background, so I tend to err on the side of looking at cell phones. And this, to me, seems a real case of, this was part of a real terrorist plot, right? Not 5 guys smoking dope, right? But actual killers, right, who did horrible things. So that said, I think both sides are trying to play to bigger audiences, right? So I think the government is trying to set a precedent, which is we get access to everything when we want. Right? And I think Apple's critique there is true. Conversely, I do think Apple is doing this for marketing reasons. Right? I think they're trying to say, we'll protect your data world, and the big bad US government won't stop us, right? Or at least we're going to be forced into it. So I'm not terribly sympathetic to either side in some ways, because I think both of them want this fight. But I personally, since I'm not sure, come down on the side of law enforcement. But my brother, who's more libertarian, is not sure and would come down on the side of not checking the phone. So it's a real trade-off.
We have time for one more question.
Right in front, sir.
There's been heavy fighting on the Libyan-Tunisian border the last few days. Is there a possibility that Tunisia could fall to the Islamic State?
So the question for those of you in back was the fighting recently on the border between Tunisia and Libya. And will this mean that Tunisia might suffer? And the real answer is yes. You never want to predict in the Middle East, right? You'll just be embarrassed. But if you look at the region, Tunisia is a very fragile democracy. It is one of the largest sources of foreign fighters going to Iraq and Syria, so they have a real jihadist problem. And it's a very porous country. It's easy to get in and out. And relatively small acts of violence can destabilize a country. And so I am tremendously worried that Tunisia, which is the only remaining little bit of hope after the Arab Spring, that might be dimmed, and that violence is going to be what does it. So I don't think it's going to be an Islamic State takeover of the country, but I could see violence going from small but significant to much more massive, and that leading to the return of effectively a military regime, leading to more of a civil war. So I think that's something that should be a tremendous concern.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much.